Hi, everyone. Has anyone ever fumbled with using a semicolon or question mark? Struggled with whether it was more appropriate to use who or whom, further or farther? Authors at Google is happy to welcome grammar guru Mignon Fogarty. Mignon is the host of Grammar Girl and founder of Quick and Dirty Tips. Grammar Girl shares quick and friendly tips to improve your writing, including tips on punctuation, style, business tips, and more. Before Grammar Girl, Mignon has worked as a magazine and technical writer. She has a BA in English from University of Washington and an MS in biology from Stanford University. With that said, let's welcome Mignon.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I used to live in the Bay Area, and it's great to be back. Great to be at Google. Google does not disappoint. I'll tell you, even your parking lot is cool. So we'll just get started, though. We're running a little late. So, who am I? I am known online as Grammar Girl, and so I have 3 new books out that came out a week or 2 ago, and so now I have 6 books about writing. The 101 word series is new, so 101 misused words you'll never confuse again, and we'll talk about some of those today. The 101 words every high school graduate should know, we actually won't talk about those today. My ultimate writing guide for students, it's the most comprehensive book available from the Grammar Girl stable of books. And then my first book was a New York Times bestseller. The Grammar Devotional is my personal favorite and the poorest selling of all my books. It's like a tip-a-day calendar in book form. I adore it. It's wonderful. It's not that popular. And then the first book I did is actually not even sure it counts. It's an 1-hour audio book. So is it a book? Is it not a book? I don't know. But the reason my first book was a 1-hour audio book is because I actually got my start podcasting. So I was a science writer in the Bay Area, and I was producing a science podcast. And at the same time, I was a technical writer and editor, and I found that the work I was editing from people were making the same mistakes over and over again. And I'd fix them, and sometimes they'd send them back to me, changed back to the wrong way. And I was getting really frustrated, and I was already podcasting, and I thought, well, I could give people a 5-minute quick tip podcast with writing tips. Nobody wants an hour-long lesson about grammar. Of course, you're all here today, so you proved me wrong. But at the time, I thought nobody wanted an hour-long lesson about grammar, and 5-minute, fun, friendly tips. I thought, maybe someone will listen. Maybe 10 people I can help. And since I was already doing the science podcast, I had all the equipment, so I made Grammar Girl, and I was literally in a coffee shop in Santa Cruz, jotted ideas down on a napkin, and had the podcast up in 3 days. And it went to the iTunes Top 100 within 3 or 4 weeks, just based on word of mouth, and it's been there ever since. That was about 5 years ago. I'm now almost up to 300 Grammar Girl podcasts. And because Grammar Girl was so successful and I had been in Silicon Valley working at startups, I knew I was onto something. So then I founded the Quick and Dirty Tips podcast network, which now has 14 or 15 shows. We've got money and public speaking, which I should listen to more, and productivity and investing and all sorts of topics. And I'm partnered with Macmillan Publishing, my publisher, on the Quick and Dirty Tips network. So that's who I am. That's maybe why you should care. And I'm so excited to be here because Google is enormously helpful in my work, and people ask me questions about Google. So in my email newsletter, I have covered, is Google a verb? And if you use it as such, should you capitalize it? And people in the language world, I don't know if you know, but in the linguistics world, there's been a lot of blogging about +1 is a verb, and everyone appreciated that you put out a style guide telling us how to format +1 and +1ing, and it's actually a hot topic in the grammar world right now. So you give me wonderful fodder for my podcast and my email newsletter. And then your tools are so useful. I use Google Ngram, which you can search in Google Books to see the frequency of word usage. And I don't remember which of my books it's in, but I wrote about, Schadenfreude, And I used Google Ngram to track the rise in the use of the word Schadenfreude over time. It was amazing. It would have been impossible before Google Ngram, or at least, for someone who isn't in academia, it would have been impossible. And also, there's something people talk about, Johnny graduated college. That's the new way of saying someone graduated, and it's wrong. You should say Johnny graduated from college. That's the current standard American English way of saying it. But what I didn't know is that 100 or so years ago, you should have said Johnny was graduated from college. So I was able to track the evolution over time of how graduated is used as a verb, again, using Google Ngram. It's amazing. And then finally, Google Books. Again, maybe someone in academia would have had access to this, but I was able to see scans of the original style guide that recommended the serial comma and the original style guide that had the rule against splitting infinitives. And for a language geek like me, that was so exciting to see the actual scans. So just big, big thank you. And I hope today I can maybe give back a little bit and maybe help you write better, just out of gratitude. So I want to convince you a little bit that word choice, punctuation, and grammar matter. Because every time I give a radio interview or a talk, someone says, why should I care? Someone in the back, whose boss made them come or something. So you know what I mean. Okay, so the commas aren't in the right place. Maybe I didn't capitalize everything properly. What does it really matter? So there was a study done that showed that if you look at identical essays, on history or economics, something that the students weren't being graded on their language, and the researchers just changed the mechanics, the punctuation and the capitalization and things like that, the students got lower grades on the essays, even though the ideas, the content was essentially the same. So I think it's reasonable to expect that in a business setting, even if you have the same ideas presented in almost exactly the same way in your email messages or your annual reports or your web pages, that having errors will affect how people perceive your ideas, the value of what you're putting forth on the paper. Now, this was a small study, but in the UK, they surveyed hiring managers. And they found that they said having a spelling or grammar error on a resume or CV was worse than showing up late to an interview and worse than swearing in an interview. I mean, that blew me away. And you're all Google, maybe you don't need to worry about finding jobs, but maybe you have a partner, or a parent, or a child who's out looking for a job, and it's really, really bad to have errors in your resume and CV. In fact, what always amazes me and amazes other people, sometimes I hire people for quick and dirty tips or an intern or something, and you'd think if you were applying for a job with Grammar Girl that you would make sure your resume doesn't have any errors. And I have seen some atrocious cover letters applying for a job with Grammar Girl. I mean, it just seems so obvious to me that you should get it right. But, so I say, okay, maybe it's not obvious, so I'll tell you, it is important to get your resumes and your cover letters. Okay, this is a bit more anecdotal, but I have literally had people come up to me at book signings and say they broke up with someone because they couldn't stand how they used language. I'm sure it wasn't the only problem in the relationship, but someone said, I just couldn't stand anymore that he said irregardless. Someone said this. And even more important is if you're using online dating sites. People send me all the time entries from online dating sites, descriptions with errors in them. They'll say, look, can you believe this? This is so funny. They send them to me because the error is somehow funny. They're not just comma errors or whatever, but some funny word that's wrong. And so bad grammar can keep you from love. If only you knew how to capitalize properly, you could be as happy as these people. And finally, who's seen the movie Almost Famous? It's one of my favorites. It's a really fun movie. This boy, he's supposed to be, somewhere between 14 and 16, and he gets an assignment with Rolling Stone to cover a band, and he goes on the road with them and writes stories for the Rolling Stone. It's a great movie. And sort of the underlying theme is that they don't know how old he is. because he corresponded with them, over the phone. He used a fake voice, and then he sent writing samples, and they were good enough that it didn't occur to him that it didn't occur to them that he was young. And I was thinking, when I was watching the movie the last time, it occurred to me, my last intern, I never talked to her on the phone. We interacted exclusively by email, and that's super common these days. I mean, how often are you interacting with people and you've never met them? Maybe you speak to them on the phone, but a lot of it is just back and forth by email. And so people are making their opinion about you, their idea of you in their head, based entirely on what you're writing. So I hope that I've convinced you that good language skills matter for life, work, and love. So, getting all excited here. I get so much adrenaline when I speak. So, today I'm going to go over some of the big questions, the errors that I see people making over and over again that people ask me about, and then we'll have time for questions in the end. So the number one reason that people come, this is the number one reason people come to my website. I'm embarrassed to tell you, I won't tell you what % of the traffic to my website is affect versus effect. And it's also the number one, usually the number one and number two searched for terms in online dictionaries. So we're going to spend more than a little bit significant time on affect versus effect. So there are exceptions to this rule. And a few years ago, I was on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and I talked about this, and again, I was all nervous. And I forgot to say there were exceptions, and I got a nasty email. Someone wrote and said, "Thank you for confusing the whole world." So I'm always really careful now to say there are exceptions. But most people don't even know the basic rule. So if you get this part right, you'll be right like 85% of the time, and that's probably better than you're doing now. Or some of you, I'm sure some of you have it down. But affect is usually a verb, and effect is usually a noun. So aardvark is a character in my books. Aardvark and Squiggly are buddies, and they fish together and stuff. So the first memory trick I came up with uses this sentence because it's all A's. So aardvark is our friend, and it's all A's. The arrows affected aardvark. And affected is a verb in that sentence. The arrows are taking an action on aardvark. They're affecting him. And you can see that it's a verb by substituting other verbs, and they work in the sentence. That's a little trick I often use, is if I don't know what kind of word to use, I'll substitute similar words and see if it makes sense. So the arrows affected aardvark. The arrows hit aardvark, they poked aardvark, and they annoyed aardvark. Those are all verbs. So if you can remember that sentence, you can compare it to a sentence you're trying to write and see if it's kind of like that sentence. And that's one way to choose the right word. And remember, the affected, the verb starts with an A because the arrows affected aardvark. Now, a second memory trick that some people seem to like better is affect is for verbs, and verbs are actions. And both affect and action start with the letter A. And you can see these kids, they're affecting the balls. They're taking action on the balls. They're making craziness happen to the balls. So then effect is the noun. And this is the example sentence with all E's for the noun. The effect was eye-popping. The effect, the thing that happened to aardvark, the noun, was eye-popping. And you can see that is a noun by substituting other nouns in the sentence. So the blood was eye-popping, the holes were eye-popping, and the sound aardvark made was eye-popping. So those are example sentences where one uses affect, the verb, and the other one uses effect, the noun. So another trick is that nouns can usually take an article. So the effect was eye-popping. She loved the effect the light had on the paintings. And the lightning effects were amazing. So you can see in the final one, there's a word that comes between the article and the noun. It's modifying effects. It's telling you what kind of effects they were. But you can still put an article in front of effect. When what you want is the noun, you can usually put an article in front of it. It doesn't work at all with the verb. So you can't say, the arrows the affected aardvark. he was the affected by the layoffs. Like, that doesn't make any sense. It's not even remotely grammatical. So if you can put an article like the in front of the word, then the one you want is affect with an E. And the way I remember it is that the ends with E, and effect starts with E. So if you have those two E's that can butt up against each other, then you want the word that starts with the E. And this is the memory trick that actually works for me. It doesn't work for a lot of people, but I'll share it with you anyway. So, because some people do say, oh, that's my favorite one. So I remember affect, verb, effect, noun. It's a mnemonic, A-V-E-N. And you can make words with A-V-E-N. So I always think of a raven, because you can spell raven, R-A-V-E-N. So if you think of that raven in your head and you're trying to remember which is the verb and which is the noun, then you have affect, verb, effect, noun. So just think of that black raven on the yellow background, and you'll have it forever. So that was one of my early tricks, one of my early tips, one of the first things I covered. And then I realized people started asking me about affective versus effective. Like, it gets harder. So effective is almost always the word you want. She's a particularly effective leader. We had an effective meeting, and effective immediately will have coffee at every meeting. So really, almost the only time you want to use affective with an A is when you're talking about a disease, or something in psychology. So I grew up in Seattle, so seasonal affective disorder, little children with their chins on windowsills looking out at the rain. So seasonal affective disorder is an example of when you would use affective with an A, but like most of the time, it's effective with an E that you want. So that's the end of the affect versus effect section. Hope I've given you some memory tricks to remember. And then it sort of leads into the next thing, because impact. When people don't know whether to use affect, they often use impact. And that bothers probably 20% of the population. 80% of the people have no idea about this, but 20% of the people, when you talk about impact as a verb, the weather impacted fourth quarter sales, people like lose their minds. They hate it. So impact as a noun is okay. You can say the weather had an impact on fourth quarter sales. But as a verb, it's better to avoid it. Like, now you know how to use affect. You can say the weather affected fourth quarter sales. You don't have to worry about this. But when you say impact, the sticklers, they think of impact only means to hit. So this, in their mind, is an impact. When you say the weather impacted Bob, they think of like hitting Bob. Or even worse, I've had people call when I was doing radio interviews, and they'll say, I think of impacted teeth, or even like an impacted colon. And like, you do not want people thinking about that when they're reading your writing. It's just better to avoid it. So that's that. Okay. And then, moving on. Another common thing that you may or may not know you do, but that bothers a lot of people, is using they or their as a singular pronoun. So absolutely, the language is evolving so that in 50 years, it won't be an issue. People already use they and their as singular pronouns in speech all the time. I bet even the sticklers, and they just don't even realize they're doing it. But in print, it still bothers some people, so I tell people to avoid it. Last week, the Philadelphia Tribune said my new book, The Ultimate Writing Guide for Students, is an essential book for every student, regardless of their age. And I posted this to Twitter and Facebook and Google+, and I knew within 20 minutes on every platform I had a comment when someone saying, shouldn't it have been his or her age? So I knew it was going to happen. So, the problem is that every student is a singular noun, and there is a plural pronoun. It's easy to fix. The sticklers would say, if you just want a quick, somewhat awkward fix, you could say essential book for every student, regardless of his or her age. singular, kind of awkward. If you're doing formal, like I used to do science writing, and so I would use his or her because, sort of a technical, formal type of writing. So it's not distracting in that context, but it probably would be for most of the things you do. So usually it's really easy to rewrite to fix this problem. You could say, it's an essential book for all students. Make your noun plural, regardless of their age. Then it works. But sometimes it's hard. And actually, I could not think of a way to make the next sentence plural. Like, maybe we could brainstorm a little bit here. So tell the next caller that he or she is the 100th caller and he or she wins a car. So we have a person of unknown sex, and we need to tell someone to tell them something. But them is plural. You can't use them, technically. And I could not, I sat and stared at the screen for, 5-10 minutes trying to think of a way to to fix this sentence, and I couldn't. Sometimes it's hard. Does anyone here, does like something jump to mind? Can anyone see how to make this plural or fix it? You could. So one of my listeners called that whiplash grammar. So you could say, tell the next caller that he is the 100th caller and she wins a car. So sometimes people will do that. They'll switch back and forth between he and she to try to be gender balanced and yet still use a singular pronoun. And that is kind of confusing because you start wondering, are they talking about a different person? And all the style. Actually, I should address all the current style guides say that just using he is no longer acceptable. It's considered sexist language, and you shouldn't use he generically. Yeah. They. You could just embrace the plural, be on the leading edge. Yeah, I mean that's probably what I would do. Yeah. You could definitely drop the second he or she. Tell the next caller he or she is the 100th caller and wins a car. So that's not so bad because you get rid of the second awkward he or she. So that would be better too. Yeah?
Replace the first he or she with caller.
Tell the next caller that the caller is the 100th caller. Tell the next person. I mean, I cannot think of a way to do this without they, and really, that is probably what I would do. I would embrace the they, and the S/he, she, yeah, and they're all. I mean, it's a problem. English doesn't have a pronoun that does this. It's a gap in our language, and that's why I think that they will fill that gap. It's an obvious need that our language needs. People are already doing it in speech. It's going to happen whether people like it or not. But you should be aware that you should avoid it whenever you can because it does really bother people. Some people, yeah.
They is okay?
They is okay if you're willing to take a little bit of heat. So, and I tell people, I say, be bold, use they, fight for advancement of our language. But you have to know that you will take criticism. I mean, like I said, obviously my followers are bigger sticklers than most people. But, I posted this to my profiles, and it had been commented on in every single place within 20 minutes. Someone said, they can't use there, it's a singular with a plural. So there are a lot of people out there who notice. So I think it's okay to use it, but just know that you should avoid it whenever you can. And when you do use it, it'll cause some people to cringe. Yeah?
One thing I think I see sometimes is people would just default to she all the time, unless it's something negative, in which case
It's true. No, you're right. So people, in sort of trying to swing the pendulum the other way from it was he for so long for the last 100 years, now they'll use she all the time, except when it's negative, and then they'll think, oh, well, I shouldn't say a negative thing about a woman, so I'll say she or he. Yeah, I find myself doing that sometimes. And if you're going to use a singular pronoun like he or she, I do think it's a good idea to sort of try to be democratic about it and switch back and forth and not always use one or always use the other. It's funny, you find yourself, you're writing about something that's been traditionally male, like a doctor. There's the classic distinction is the doctor-nurse, a man-woman. And like every time if I'm writing about a doctor now and I need to use a singular pronoun, I'll use she, just because it's sort of the opposite of what has been traditional. It is a challenge. And that's another reason I think they is eventually going to win. It's so much less loaded. So, what? Not supposed to be there. Okay, we're gonna wing it. So next we're gonna talk about apostrophes, and just gonna get to this. Where is it? I have a movie for you. Okay, this is a clip from one of my favorite videos at YouTube.
We like proper English and we cannot lie. You YouTubers can't deny that when illiterate kids start hating on your vids with ignorant, crass replies, you're ashamed of your fellow man because you realize they don't understand basic principles of writing. Plus their insults are unexciting. Oh baby, you want to the YouTube haters and slammers? Just listen to one last thing. While we still have your attention, we got one more thing to mention. Sometimes your is possessive, but other times it means you are. Put apostrophes when you need them, and other ones just delete them. So haters, if you're too confused about which form of there to use, go to Sister Salad's YouTube page and learn some ways to make your comments less whack.
So it seems so simple. It's your, there with the apostrophes. And it's true, when you go to YouTube and you see the comments, it's always the wrong it's and the wrong you're and were instead of we are and were. So, like, what's the deal? Why can't people get this? Let's see if we can go back. Oh, no. Okay. So, and I will say, I am completely guilty of this too. It's a typo. I have to believe that most people know the difference between your, Y-O-U apostrophe R-E, and Y-O-U-R. But, we think nouns, possessive, S. You think possessive apostrophe, and when you're typing fast, it's easy to get the wrong one. And so embarrassing. I know the difference, but in last week's Grammar Girl transcript, there was an IT apostrophe S, where there should not have been an apostrophe, and a your, a Y-O-U-R, when there should have been a Y-O-U-R-E. These are, I commonly make these as typos, and my editor didn't have time to edit my script last week. So Grammar Girl went out with its and your errors, typos. So I'm not saying, you can't say you're stupid if you get it wrong, right? That would be saying I was stupid. But it's a common typo, and it's something to watch for in your writing because it's so easy to make, because you have that association in your mind of apostrophes with possessives. So one way that I've been thinking about it that sort of helps me get it right most of the time is that I noticed that we use apostrophe S to make nouns possessive, but we don't to make pronouns possessive. I think a lot of people don't realize that none of the pronouns use an apostrophe S to become possessive. So his, her, their, its, and your, those are all possessive pronouns. And the problem is the ones that, well, part of the problem is the ones that end with S. So its is the possessive form of it, even though if you were writing about the chair, which is an it, you would use an apostrophe S. Only nouns take an apostrophe S to become possessive. And there's actually, oh gosh, my slides are all out of order, so I don't know what's next. Okay, so, but one thing I did want to tell you about apostrophes and possessives is that your spell checker will mess you up. So children, so it does every time. So children is plural. And to make children's possessive, you need an apostrophe S. The children's store, the children's books, it's an apostrophe S. But every single time, spell checker will mark it wrong. Same with men's and women's, like men's clothes, women's hats. It takes an apostrophe S and your spell checker will mark it wrong. So it's just something to know. And it's so funny. People will write to me and they'll say, well, I'm pretty sure this is right, but spell checker keeps telling me I'm wrong. And they question themselves. Like, spell checker is wrong a lot. So just view it as something that highlights things you should look at. It's not God. It's not always right. And I'm amazed how many people will just accept what spell checker tells them. It's very dangerous. So, boy, okay. So, serial comma. Who knows what the serial comma is? Everyone? No, good, not everyone, good. So, the serial comma is this comma before the final and in a list. So lions, comma, tigers, comma, and bears. Oh my, it's that comma before the and. It's called the serial comma because you use it in a series like this. And it's also called the Oxford comma because it's used by the Oxford University Press, which is one of the biggest presses in the world. And there was a big kerfuffle a couple weeks ago. I don't know if anyone heard about it, but someone on Twitter, an anonymous tweeter called Ranty Editor, was at the Oxford University website and found a style guide that said not to use the Oxford comma on the Oxford University Press website. And it was hard to tell from the page. It looked as if it were a university-wide style sheet, but it was actually for the PR department. And when you downloaded the whole PDF, it was clear it was just for one department, and the press often used the press. So I should back up. The serial comma is a style. So a lot of people will learn either you always use it or you never use it, and they'll think everyone else is wrong. But it's actually a style choice. So book publishers like Oxford University Press and the Chicago Manual of Style, they use the serial comma. But the Associated Press doesn't. They say to leave it out unless it causes confusion. So that's why you'll see it done both ways. So the other people who do it the way you don't do it are not wrong. It's just a style choice. So because it was the Oxford University Press website, and they write for newspapers, and newspapers tend not to use the serial comma, and that was why they had the advice not to use the serial comma. But everyone freaked out because if Oxford University didn't use the Oxford comma anymore, that would be sacrilege. And they quickly issued a statement, and it was fun excitement in the grammar world, kind of like +1ing, you know. So here's an example. So people will say, well, when would it ever be confusing to not have a serial comma? So this is a hypothetical book dedication, you know, to my parents, the Pope, and Jackie Kennedy. And that's really clear with the commas. But if you leave out that second comma, you get to my parents, the Pope and Jackie Kennedy. So it's a made-up example, but there are instances where you need a serial comma to avoid confusion. And often it's when the last things in your list could be paired in some way. So we'll talk about less and fewer. This is commonly confused words. So this is Aardvark again. As I said, he likes to fish. Less is for things that can't be counted, and fewer is for things that can be counted. So water can't be counted. I mean, a glass of water, you could say, you know, we have fewer glasses of water than we did last week. But water itself in a lake can't be counted, so that you would say we have less water in the lake. So things that can't be counted use less. So less water. Things that can be counted use fewer. So I should eat fewer M&Ms. I should leave fewer books on my desk. I should have brought fewer slides. So that's the difference between less and fewer. And this was funny. I went to the Penn and Teller show in Las Vegas last year, and Penn was very proud of his sign. It's a little hard to read, but one of their posters is fewer audience injuries than last year. And I guess the marketing people had originally written it as less audience injuries than last year, and he made them change it to be grammatically correct. And so we took our picture together with a thumbs up on his fewer audience injuries, because audience injuries are countable. Another thing I see people having trouble with, especially in business, you see this all the time in business, is improper capitalization. So capitalizing the name of your award, or an award would be capitalized, but you know, your tacos aren't crunchier if you capitalize the word taco. So you capitalize things that are proper nouns. You capitalize something because it's the name of something. It's interesting, a long time ago in English, all the nouns used to be capitalized. If you look at the Constitution, all the nouns are capitalized. It was trendy back when our nation was founded. But somewhere along the way, and I haven't figured out why yet, I've been searching Google books actually, trying to figure out the story, but historically, but somewhere along the way, English changed so that we only capitalize proper nouns. We only capitalize nouns that are the name of something. So you capitalize the name of historic documents like the Constitution and the Magna Carta, because those are documents that have a name. And you capitalize the names of bills and acts like the Social Security Act and the Patriot Act. You capitalize the name of a department when it's the formal name of a department, but you don't say, I took a chemistry class Friday. You don't capitalize chemistry because it's not the name of anything, it's just a description of a topic. You capitalize the name of a bridge, you capitalize Golden Gate Bridge when you're referring to it, but you don't capitalize bridge just when you use it in a sentence. You say, we went across the bridge, bridge is lowercase. But if you say, we went across the Golden Gate Bridge is capitalized. That's a really common, like marketing people in particular just love to capitalize things. Like they think it makes it look more important, and it doesn't, it's just wrong. So. Oh, here's my run-on sentence slide. Okay, so who thinks a run-on sentence is just a really long sentence? No one will admit to it. I know some of you think that, because a lot of people think a run-on sentence is just a really long sentence. But a run-on sentence is actually when you join two main clauses without proper punctuation. And they can be hard to read. So, and they can be short. They can be really short. So you can say, I like pizza, Joe went to Domino's. Squiggly cried, Aardvark yelled. Beth went to a yoga class, Ben came along. So these are all run-on sentences, even though they're really quite short. What they need is a something to separate the two main clauses. So the one I can reach, Beth went to a yoga class, Ben came along. You could put a period there. You could make it two sentences. You could put a semicolon. That's what semicolons do. A lot of people don't like semicolons anymore, and I have no idea why. But they're very useful. You use them to join two main clauses when the main clauses are conceptually related to each other, when they have something to do with each other. You know, and Ben coming along definitely has to do with Beth going to yoga class. They're very related ideas, so it would be completely valid to use a semicolon right here to fix that run-on sentence. You can also use a comma with a conjunction. So you could say, Beth went to a yoga class, comma, and Ben came along. So there are lots of ways to fix run-on sentences, but you don't want to leave them like this because I don't know if you can tell as you're reading it, but your brain just kind of wants to pause somewhere. It's like it's leading you down the wrong path, and you realize something's missing when you get to the end, but you don't know why. They're kind of hard to read. And here's an example. You can fix them all with semicolons, and I love the semicolon, so I probably would. And there's the semicolon, completely out of order. Where is it? Because here we go. This is the thing, I think we're running out of time, but I want to finish with quotation marks, because this is another really common question, and there's a reason you are confused. So when you have a quotation, people often don't know whether to put the comma or the period inside the closing quotation mark. And the reason you don't know is because they do it differently in British English. So I was looking for examples. I pulled up the BBC website a couple of days ago while I was putting together the final slides. And I could not figure out what rules they were following in British English. Sometimes they were inside, sometimes they were outside. The sentences seemed the same to me. I couldn't tell what they were doing. But in Britain, they call it logical punctuation. I could not determine the logic, but they call it, they use logical quotation marks, logical punctuation, something like that. And so sometimes they're inside and sometimes they're outside the closing quotation. In the United States, the period and the comma always go inside the closing quotation mark. It's called, it's actually called I think it's called printer's typography or something like that. It has to do with, in the early printing process, the period and the comma would get broken if they were outside the quotation mark. It was an artifact of printing when they used real printing presses and little letters. So this is my US-centric memory trick. So inside the US, inside the quotation mark. So it's easy to remember, inside, inside. And it's different. So that's periods and quotation marks. And it's different for question marks and exclamation points. So I don't have a slide, but the question mark, if the thing inside quotations is the only question, then the question mark goes inside that closing quotation mark. If your whole sentence, including the quotation, the whole thing, if that's a question, then you put the question outside the closing quotation mark. So that you can think of it as the question mark stays with whatever part is the question. And it's the same for exclamation points. It doesn't come up as often, but the periods and the commas always go inside. And then, we'll do one more just for fun before we take questions. So this is another one of my favorite websites is the blog of unnecessary quotation marks. Bethany is the author. I forget her last name, but she's great. And she has a book out too. And the whole website is devoted to signs and photos of people that put words in quotation marks that shouldn't be. And when you put a word in so you can put, I put words in quotation marks all the time because when you're talking about a word as a word, so I'll say, when you're using a which, it's okay to drop the next clause or something like that. You put which in quotation marks, or you can italicize or bold it, but you need to highlight a word some way when you're using it not for its meaning. But the more common way to use quotation marks around a word is they're called sneer quotes or scare quotes. And it means that you don't mean the thing that's in quotation marks. And one of my favorites is a truck that says something like, Bob's Meat. And you wonder, what is Bob actually selling out of that truck? This one just says, fully furnished short-term lease. And her little funny comment is, you can never leave. And once you start noticing this, you'll see it everywhere. People who make signs love to put things in quotation marks. Yeah? I don't know how it started. I do know at one of my book signings, two ladies came up who worked at a sign shop, and they were so apologetic. They said, we try to tell people. We try to make them stop, but they're our customers, and we have to do what they want. But we try. They felt so bad. So that's another really common error. I bet if you go around Google and you go into your kitchens and your bathrooms and anywhere people post handwritten signs, you will find signs that have things in quotation marks, somehow for emphasis or as if they were underlined. But so don't use quotation marks in that way because it's funny, and a picture of it might show up on Bethany's blog. So those are the main things. Oh, I did want to mention that, okay. So how do you settle disputes? This is important because people spend hours arguing about these language issues, and that's why I appreciated so much that you put out the style guide for +1ing and +1, because then that keeps people from arguing. And that's how you keep from arguing. You have a style. You have a house style guide. If you're working in a group, you decide among yourselves what style you're going to follow, what you're going to do when these issues come up. So I would be surprised if you didn't have an internal style guide or a recommended style guide for Google, but if you don't, pick one in your group and decide what you're going to follow. And then I wanted to say, a lot of the pictures I used were Creative Commons images from Flickr, and these are where you can find them all, and it'll be in my presentation, which I believe you'll have access to. So that's my prepared talk. I'm out of breath. And I'd be happy to take questions for as long as you want, and they have books over there too. I'll sign those. Yeah?
One thing I've been wondering about, I see people think that all plurals need apostrophes.
I'm sorry, can you say that?
People seem to think that all plurals need apostrophes. And I had an example, a challenge for you.
Okay.
I was wearing Levi's, and I could see that an apostrophe might look right there.
Yeah.
I suppose in his BVDs. So is apostrophe wrong? Or should you use skip it when it's a word like trousers, or we know it's plural?
Yeah, so the question was about apostrophes to make things plural, and I think it was also about, are you wondering how you make a word that ends with S possessive? Is that? That one you know. Okay, well that was one of my missing slides. So that was something a lot of people don't know actually, is that it's a style choice. So if you're talking about Levi's fourth quarter earnings, you could say Levi's with just an apostrophe, or you could say Levi's with an apostrophe S, and it's a style choice. That one might not be because of the way it's pronounced, but Kansas, like the Supreme Court justices actually argued about whether it should be Kansas's statute with an apostrophe S or just an apostrophe, and I forget what they call them, the majority and the dissenting opinion, they spelled it differently for the same case. Those big brouhaha in law journals. But no, you don't use an apostrophe to make things plural. It's not common to see someone use an apostrophe after something like Levi's to make it plural. Levi's would be, I think that is sort of like fish in that the plural and the singular would be the same. You would say, I have 20 pairs of Levi's at home.
But there are things like, I have some 20s in my pocket.
Right, and that's when it's much more common for people to use apostrophes. Like after an abbreviation, CDs, we had 50 CDs in the closet. It used to be it's one of those things that evolving. It used to be more commonly acceptable to use an apostrophe to make something like that plural. The New York Times was the last holdout. So the New York Times used an apostrophe to make acronyms like that, initialisms, to make them plural until just 2 or 3 years ago. And people would write to me every week to tell me the New York Times was doing it wrong. But it was a style choice. Now that the New York Times has stopped doing it, every other major style guide says not to use apostrophes to make things like that plural. So now I say, don't do it, it's wrong. But it's something that has changed over time. But how would you make Levi's plural? What's an example where you wouldn't use pairs? When would you say, I have 50 Levi's? You wouldn't just say, I have 50
I
Levi's.
think CD is actually a better example. I was trying to make a different one because I find myself wondering, should I just say CDS with no apostrophe?
Yeah, it's CDS with no apostrophe. Even when the abbreviation, I can't remember. Someone asked me about OSs, operating systems, and I'm pretty sure I think it's OSES to make something like that plural, but if it doesn't end with an S, just add an S. And even if RBIs, runs brought in, it's still RBIs. You put the S on the end, even though it's actually runs that's plural if you were to spell it out. Someone over here had a question?
I'm just wondering what you think about camel case.
Camel case, yeah, I covered that a while ago, and it's in one of my books. I have a cartoon about it. So if it's a company name, then you should write it that way. You should use it. Well, I should tell you, camel case is when you have an uppercase letter in the middle of a word. So PowerPoint, the P is capitalized. McMahon for a name. Yeah, I guess that would be camel case. It comes up so much more often with the names of companies, or the band Outcast, they capitalize the K. They use a K. I mean, what do you expect? I mean, really, we're going to hold them to high standards when they spell Outcast with a K? So, I think it's kind of annoying. It's better to avoid it. It comes from programming, because often you can't put spaces in variable names and file names and things like that. So it started with programmers, using capitals in the middle of everything to differentiate word from word. And there was someone, I know what it was. It was someone who had a company called NetEase wrote in and said that he thinks the drive to use camel case so often in company names is because it's hard to find a domain name. And so you have to string lots of words together. And then if you don't capitalize the first part of the next word, it can look weird, because he said his parents always tease him that his company was knee tease, like your knee, because if you didn't capitalize the E in NetEase, it looked like knee tease. So there's a drive. There are a lot of logical practical reasons to have camel case. And if a company writes their name that way, then you should write it that way. But just try to avoid it when it's unnecessary. Yeah.
I have another plural question, Latin versus English. So, is it okay to say forums?
Forums? Oh, yeah. Instead of fora.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like some of that stuff is disappearing.
It is.
We don't need to know as much Latin grammar as before.
Yeah. The one I was really surprised about is agenda. So agenda is plural. And the singular, if you want to say, you would say, what's this meeting's agendum? If you wanted to use classical language. So a lot of that is going away, and a lot of it, so in some instances there are two ways to say it. So index, I think the Wall Street uses indexes, and scientists still tend to use indices. So, in some instances, both the Americanized version and the classical version coexist, and in other instances, the more modern version has taken over, like with agendas. I would say forums. Yeah. Yeah?
Personal pet peeve about try and do something is that, but it's so common. I see it written all the time. Is that becoming acceptable?
It's actually one of my pet peeves too. So people will say, I'm going to try and call you tomorrow. Well, that means you're going to do two things. You're going to try and you're going to call. The proper way to say it is, I will try to call you tomorrow. The to is a preposition, and the function of prepositions is often to connect words together, to connect ideas together. And so the proper phrase is, I will try to call you tomorrow. But you're right that try and is becoming pervasive. I don't know if it's a losing battle or not. I don't intend to give up on it yet. There are some battles I have given up on. Momentarily is one. So, momentarily means for a moment. So if you say, the plane will land in Phoenix momentarily, that means you've got to touch and go, traditionally. But it's become so common for momentarily to mean in a moment that it's just a lost cause. We're never going to win that battle, so I give up, So, but I haven't given up on try to yet. You have a question, or are you leaving?
Question.
Okay.
When is it appropriate to use underlines in printed text versus italics?
Well, it depends. When should you use underlines versus italics? Well, it kind of depends on what style guide you follow. So the Modern Language Association, which is usually a style guide used for writing research papers, tends to favor underlining more than other style guides. But since the rise of the net, where an underline means a link, underlining has really fallen out of favor. So I prefer not to use underlining whenever I can avoid it, just because people think it's clickable then. I mean, it's just, our brains have changed how we think about underlining. But, typically an underline would be, I think it's for the title of a work. Like in the MLA, you underline the title of a book maybe. I'm not super familiar with their style. Okay. But if you're in a font that doesn't have italics. But usually if you have italics, you have underlining. The bigger problem is on sites like Twitter and Facebook. And I haven't checked Google Plus yet to see if they do this, but you can't make italics or underlining on these social networking sites. And so then you end up putting things in quotes, but it bothers me because, so if I'm putting the title of a book, titles of books don't go in quotes in any style, but it's the only way to really highlight them. When you could put underlines next to each of them or asterisks, but asterisks really mean bold. It's frustrating. And in the publishing industry, they write book titles in all caps. It's sort of an inside the industry thing. It's not any acceptable style guide, but it's all throughout publishing. So then I started maybe trying, a couple times I've written my book titles on Twitter and Facebook and Google Plus, all caps. But then it just looks like you're screaming, and that bothers me too. I just want italics. But I don't think it's going to happen. So You have to come up. I have formally said that my preferred style is all caps because it conserves space. You're not, you've got 140 characters, for example. You don't want to use 2 of them on quotation marks. But I still don't like it. I'm not resolved to it. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm pretty loud too, so. Let's say someone has a nickname. You can put that in quotes, right? Like, say it's a good salesperson. They call her the closer or something. So in that case, does the period still go within the quotes if that ends the sentence?
Yeah, the period always goes inside the quotation marks. And it actually brings up an interesting point. So you capitalize nicknames, but you don't capitalize terms of endearment. And this is something people are often confused about. So, if you say, our salesperson, Bunny, had a great year, you capitalize Bunny if that's what everyone calls her. But if you said, if you're coming up to, say, your boyfriend and you say, hey, sweetie, like, unless you always call him sweetie and that's what you think of as his name, sweetie is lowercase because it's just a term of endearment. And sometimes it's hard to find that, figure out which is which, but you capitalize nicknames and you don't capitalize terms of endearment. Yeah?
Commas before but when it's not used as a conjunction, or so when it's not used to separate 2 independent clauses, so to indicate difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so usually you don't put a comma before but. So commas are super tricky. There are like 25 different comma rules, and one of the sort of exceptions is that you can always use a comma when you need it to avoid confusion, and you can use it to show contrast. So you could say, squiggly hid behind the tree, comma, but felt brave. Because those are in such stark contrast that the comma helps draw attention to the contrast. And again, it's one of those style calls, like how much contrast do you need before you can use a comma? But you can in instances where you're showing a contrast.
How about that versus which?
That versus which, yeah. So another common one. So I have a memory trick for that too. So the memory trick is that, with apologies to Hermione Granger, you can always throw out the whiches and no harm will be done. So if you have a clause, which is for non-restrictive clauses and that is for restrictive clauses. So what that means is, it's better with an example. So you could say, I like diamonds, comma, which are expensive. So because diamonds are always expensive, at least in my world, the which are expensive is a non-essential clause. It's sort of restating the obvious. You don't really need it. So it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence if you get rid of that which clause. So if you can throw out the whiches and it doesn't change the meaning, then which is the right choice. Now, I could say, dogs that bark make me crazy. So that bark is an essential part of that sentence. It changes the kind of dogs we're talking about. I love dogs. It's just dogs that bark that make me crazy. So if you can't throw it out, and so you can't throw out the whiches, so you needed that instead. So there are some exceptions actually to that rule, but that's the basic rule. Come on, someone stump me. No, well, thank you again for having me and for making all the cool Google tools that I use. I hope you learned something. And I have a free podcast at iTunes and a free email newsletter at my website, which is quickanddirtytips.com. And I'll stick around and answer questions and sign books and stuff, whatever you want. So thank you.